The wind coming off the Atlantic was cold that day, but the grip of my son's hand on my arm was colder. Everything at my husband's funeral was perfect. The expensive white lilies, the polished oak of the casket, the measured grief on the faces of our friends. My son stood beside me, playing the part of devoted children to a grieving mother. But I felt like a ghost at my own husband's farewell. They saw a fragile old widow. I knew I was being erased from the empire I helped build. Then, as my eldest began a eulogy filled with perfect, empty words, my phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number that changed everything. It said, "I am still alive. The accident was a lie. Trust no one." Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Eleanor Vance, and what I'm about to share with you is the story of how my world ended and then began again, all during my husband's funeral. The wind coming off the Atlantic was cold that day, a biting, damp chill that seeped through my thin black coat and settled deep in my bones. It carried the scent of salt and low tide, a smell I had always associated with our home and with Arthur, a scent of comfort and permanence. But that day, it felt alien, hostile, as if the world itself had turned against me. Everything at my husband Arthur's funeral was perfect, far too perfect. The white lilies, flown in from some exotic place I couldn't name, were pristine and unnervingly scentless, their waxy petals like sculpted ice. The oak of the casket gleamed with a fresh, deep polish, reflecting the grim, gray sky above. Our friends and business associates, people we'd known for decades, stood in tight, murmuring clusters, their faces arranged in masks of measured grief. It was a performance, a well-rehearsed play for the passing of a powerful man, and I was its unwilling star. My sons, Julian and Leo, stood on either side of me, each a pillar of strength, or so it would seem to an observer. They were handsome in their dark, tailored suits, their faces somber and appropriate for the occasion. Julian, my eldest, held my arm in a grip that was meant to be comforting but felt more like a restraint, his fingers cold and firm, a subtle assertion of control. Leo, younger and always the more sensitive of the two, simply stood beside me, a silent, imposing presence whose quietness felt more like distance than support. I felt nothing from them. No shared warmth against the biting wind. No genuine, soul-deep sorrow that should have connected the three of us. It was a terrifying emptiness, a void that was colder and deeper than the freshly dug grave before us. I was a ghost at my own husband's farewell, a prop in their meticulously staged production. In their eyes, I saw my reflection not as a mother or a partner, but as a fragile old widow, a relic from a past they were eager to put behind them, someone to be managed and placated. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the wind, that I was being erased from the empire I had helped build from nothing. The minister's voice droned on, a string of platitudes about life and loss that held no meaning, the words dissolving into the salty air. I tuned it out, focusing instead on the rigid set of Julian's jaw, the way Leo stared blankly at a point just beyond the casket, his eyes unfocused. Then, Julian stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. His voice, thick with a carefully crafted emotion, began to fill the silence, weaving a tale of a brilliant, driven father he had admired. It was a good speech, filled with perfect, empty words about legacy and honor. And in that moment, as he spoke, my phone, buried deep in my coat pocket, gave a single dissonant vibration. I fumbled for it, my fingers stiff with cold, expecting a message of condolence from some distant relative. But the number was unknown. The message contained only a few words. Words that ripped through the carefully constructed reality of the day and set my heart hammering against my ribs. I am still alive. The accident was a lie. Trust no one. Back in the sprawling seaside house that Arthur and I had built plank by plank, dream by dream, The air was thick with the scent of catered food and forced sympathy. The rooms were crowded with people I barely knew, their hushed conversations a dull roar in my ears. Julian and Leo moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting condolences. Their faces were models of dignified grief. I allowed myself to be guided to a wingback chair by the large bay window overlooking the turbulent gray ocean, a place where Arthur used to sit for hours, watching the storms roll in. People would approach, murmur a few empty words, squeeze my hand with limp, damp palms, and move on. I was an object of pity. The bereaved wife, a statue placed in a chair. The message in my pocket felt like a burning coal, a secret, terrible truth in a house full of elegant lies. After a few hours, which felt like an eternity, the crowd began to thin. The last of the guests departed, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more oppressive than the earlier noise. The house felt cavernously empty, yet I was not alone. In the grand living room, a space we had designed together to feel warm and inviting. A new gathering had formed. Julian and Leo were there, along with two men in severe suits I recognized as the family lawyers. They had spread papers across the mahogany coffee table, their heads bent together in serious discussion. They didn't speak of Arthur, or of memories, or of loss. They spoke of restructuring, of assets, of power of attorney. They spoke of the future of Vance Construction as if their father's body had not just been lowered into the cold, wet earth. "Mother?" Julian said, finally noticing my presence in the corner. His voice was soft, laced with a patronizing tone that set my teeth on edge. "You should be resting. This is all too much for you." He gestured vaguely at the papers, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Don't you worry about any of this. Leo and I will handle everything." Leo nodded in agreement, his expression unreadable, his eyes avoiding mine. "He's right, Mom. We've got it covered. We just need to make some quick decisions to ensure the company remains stable." I looked at their faces, searching for the boys I had raised, the children who had scraped their knees and cried in my arms. I saw only strangers, their eyes hard with an ambition that had eclipsed everything else. The message pulsed in my mind. Trust no one. I simply nodded, sinking deeper into the role they had assigned me, that of the frail, clueless widow. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice a weak whisper. "Whatever you think is best." Their shared look of relief was palpable, almost insulting. They had dismissed me. That was their first mistake. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind outside, sounded like a threat. I left my cold, empty bed and walked down the darkened hallway to Arthur's study. The room was untouched, just as he had left it that fateful morning. The scent of old books, pipe tobacco, and his familiar cologne hung in the air, a painful, ghostly presence that made my chest ache. I ran my hand over the back of his worn leather chair, half expecting him to look up from his desk and smile, to ask me how my day was. My gaze swept across the shelves, the framed photographs of the boys when they were young and smiling, the blueprints for our very first project tacked to a corkboard. I was searching, though I didn't know for what. A clue? A sign? Something to prove I wasn't losing my mind. My fingers traced the edge of his large oak desk, and I noticed something I hadn't in 40 years of living in this house. A small, almost invisible seam in the wood paneling beneath the main drawer. Driven by an instinct I couldn't explain, I pressed against it. A section of the panel clicked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a cheap, disposable phone, a burner phone, and a sheaf of documents. It was a contract, a proposal for a merger between Vance Construction and a ruthless competitor, a corporation known for hostile takeovers. The pages were covered in Arthur's furious red ink, words like never and betrayal circled and underlined. Tucked into the last page was a handwritten note, his script messy and agitated. "They are selling the soul of this family. J&L are blinded by greed. They don't see the trap." My blood ran cold. This was it. This was the beginning of the truth. I took the burner phone, my hand trembling as I powered it on. It was password protected. Of course, I tried the obvious things, first our anniversary, the boys' birthdays, the company's founding date. Nothing. Then I remembered a place, a small, insignificant diner where Arthur had first proposed to me, a place only the two of us knew the meaning of. I typed in the name Rosebud. The phone unlocked. There was only one message in the drafts folder, unsent. It was addressed to a single contact labeled My Anchor. It was me. Eleanor, it read. If you are reading this, it means they went through with it. I have a plan. It's risky, but it's the only way to save what we built. Don't mourn me. Fight for me. The truth is in the work, the old work. The old work. The words echoed in my mind. What did he mean before I could process it? The new phone, the one I'd received the message on, vibrated again. Another text from the same unknown number. It was as if someone was watching me, guiding me. Check the safety logs for the quarry site, the day of the accident. The foreman knows. The quarry. It was one of our oldest, most challenging sites. Arthur had been overseeing a difficult expansion there personally. The official report said a controlled blast had gone wrong, causing a rock slide. An unfortunate accident. A lie. The next morning, I dressed myself as the woman my sons expected me to be. A grieving widow in muted gray. My movements slow, my eyes downcast. I let them fuss over me at breakfast, their concern as hollow as their eulogies. Julian informed me that he had arranged for a nurse to come and stay with me. Just for a little while. Mother, to make sure you're taking your medication and eating properly. It was a prison sentence disguised as kindness. I knew I had to act quickly. Feigning a desire for some fresh air, I told them I wanted to visit the small garden nursery in the next town over, a place I often went to buy flowers. They exchanged a look, but Julian eventually agreed, handing me the keys to my own car as if granting a great favor. Don't be too long, he warned. I promised I wouldn't. But I didn't drive toward the nursery. I drove toward the quarry. The site was eerily quiet, the massive stone walls of the quarry absorbing all sound, making the world feel small and claustrophobic. I found the foreman, a man named Bill Peterson, in a small, cluttered site office. Bill had worked for Arthur for over 30 years. He was a craggy-faced man with honest, tired eyes. When he saw me, his face crumpled with a mixture of pity and fear. Mrs. Vance, he stammered, wringing his greasy hands. I'm so sorry for your loss. Mr. Vance he was a good man. I know he was. Bill, I said softly, closing the door behind me. I need to see the safety logs from the day of the accident. A flicker of panic crossed his face. The police took everything. It's all part of the official investigation. Don't lie to me, Bill, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the fear I felt. Arthur trusted you. I'm trusting you now. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. He saw something there. Not a broken widow, but the woman who had once balanced the books on her kitchen table and negotiated with suppliers with a baby on her hip. He let out a long, shaky breath. They made me delete the server logs. Mrs. Vance. Julian himself stood right behind me and watched me do it. Said it was to simplify the insurance claim. He shook his head. But Mr. Vance, he was always 2 steps ahead. He was paranoid these last few months. He set up a private server, a ghost in the machine. He called it, the kids don't know about it. He scribbled an address on a piece of paper, a dusty, forgotten storage unit the company rented on the industrial side of town. Then he reached into his desk and pulled out a simple key card. This will get you in the main door. The server is in the back room, behind the old blueprint cabinets. The password is the name of his first boat, the Sea Serpent. I hadn't thought of that old rickety sailboat in decades. Be careful, Mrs. Vance, Bill whispered, his eyes darting toward the window. Julian came by yesterday, asking questions, asking if his father had spoken to anyone, if he seemed different. He's sniffing around. He's suspicious, as if on cue. A sleek black sedan, identical to Julian's, swept past the main gate of the quarry. Bill flinched. You have to go. Now. He rushed me out a back door, leaving me with the key card clutched in my hand, a small piece of plastic that felt like the key to everything. The drive to the storage facility was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every car in my rearview mirror felt like a threat. The storage facility was a desolate place, a grid of anonymous metal doors under a washed-out sky. I found the unit and the key card worked. The door rolled up with a loud groan, revealing a space crammed with old furniture, boxes of files, and the ghosts of projects past. It smelled of dust and decay. In the back, behind a row of tall metal blueprint cabinets, I found a small unmarked door. My heart pounded as I entered the cramped, windowless room. There, on a makeshift shelf, sat a single computer server, its small green light blinking rhythmically in the gloom. I powered on the connected monitor and typed in the password. Sea Serpent Access Granted. The screen came to life, displaying a simple file directory. There were folders for every major project, but one was labeled simply Contingency. I clicked on it. Inside were a handful of files. The first was a video file, dated 2 days before the accident. I held my breath and opened it. Arthur's face filled the screen. He looked older, exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than I'd ever seen them. He was in this very room, speaking directly to the camera, speaking to me. Eleanor, he began, his voice raspy with strain. If you're seeing this, my plan is in motion. Our sons, they're not the men we raised. They've been talking with Trident Corp for months, planning to sell them the company from the inside. I was the only thing standing in their way. He paused, and for a moment, I saw the immense pain in his eyes. They tried to have me declared incompetent. They had doctors, lawyers, all of it. When that failed, I knew they wouldn't stop. The accident at the quarry, it's their plan. Julian's plan. I found the emails. He held up a printout to the camera. They're going to rig the blast, make it look like a tragic error, but I won't be there. He took a deep breath. I'm going away. Ellie, I have to disappear to give myself time to gather the final proof we need to expose them and save our company. I've set things in motion. Bill Peterson knows what to do. The messages you've received, they're from a trusted friend, guiding you. I couldn't risk contacting you directly. They're watching you. His face softened. I love you. You've always been the strong one. Be strong now. Our life's work is in your hands. The video ended, leaving me in stunned silence, tears streaming down my face. It was a grief sharper and more profound than what I had felt at the funeral. Because this was real. This was the true loss. I quickly opened the other files. There were copies of the undeleted safety logs, clearly showing the blast had been deliberately overpowered. There were screenshots of encrypted emails between Julian and an executive at Trident Corp, coldly discussing the removal of the obstacle and the subsequent steps for the takeover. It was all there, a meticulous, damning trail of evidence. I pulled a USB drive from my purse and began copying everything, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse. The progress bar on the screen seemed to crawl. Every second felt like an hour. Suddenly, a sound from outside the small room made me freeze, the loud clang of the main storage unit door rolling down. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the hidden room. My blood turned to ice. Julian, he had followed me. I frantically tried to eject the USB drive, but my panicked clicks were clumsy. The doorknob to the server room began to turn. I braced myself, my mind racing. There was no escape. The door swung open. But it wasn't Julian. It was Leo. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He looked from me to the computer screen, the evidence of his brother's treachery displayed for him to see. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared. His expression a chaotic mix of horror, guilt, and dawning understanding. "Mom," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "What have you done?" "The truth, Leo," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I found the truth. Did you know what Julian was planning?" He couldn't meet my eyes. He shook his head, a gesture that was more confusion than denial. I knew he wanted Dad out of the way. I thought he just meant forcing him to retire. I never thought he would. His voice trailed off. He looked back at the door, his fear palpable. We have to go. Now. Julian knows you're here. He tracked your car. He's on his way. In that moment, I saw a flicker of the boy I once knew, the son who had always lived in his older brother's shadow, torn between loyalty and fear. He made a decision. He reached over and quickly, expertly, finished copying the files and ejected the USB drive, pressing it into my hand. Go out the back, he said, pointing to a small emergency exit I hadn't noticed. It leads to the alley. Go. I'll stall him. Leo, I started, but he cut me off. Just go, Mom, please. I didn't hesitate. I clutched the drive and slipped out the back exit, my heart aching with a new, complicated pain for the son I was leaving behind. I didn't know if he was trying to save me or just save himself. Maybe it was both. The next day, Julian called for an emergency board meeting, the agenda to unanimously approve the merger with Trident Corp, citing the company's instability following the tragic death of its chief executive officer. He was confident, arrogant, believing he had won. He assumed I was at home, sedated and managed by his nurse. He didn't know that I had dismissed her the night before. He didn't know that Leo had called me, his voice low and urgent, to tell me the time and place of the meeting. I walked into the boardroom at Vance Construction headquarters 10 minutes after the meeting had started. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. Julian's face went from shock to fury in a split second. Leo, sitting beside him, looked down at the table, unable to meet my gaze. Mother, Julian said, his voice tight with controlled rage. This is a private meeting. You shouldn't be here. On the contrary, Julian, I replied, my voice clear and steady, echoing in the silent room. As the co-founder and the largest single shareholder in this company, I believe this is exactly where I should be. I walked to the head of the table, placed my laptop down, and connected it to the large projector screen. Before you vote on the future of the company my husband and I poured our lives into, I said, looking at each board member in turn. I have a short presentation I'd like you to see. I didn't look at Julian. I just pressed play. Arthur's face appeared on the screen, his voice filling the boardroom. The board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. I watched Julian's composure crumble, his face draining of all color. When the video ended, I didn't pause. I clicked to the next file, displaying the damning emails between him and Trident Corp for everyone to see. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Just as the last email faded from the screen, the boardroom doors opened. 2 uniformed police officers walked in, followed by a detective I had spoken with early that morning. Julian Vance, the detective said, his voice calm and authoritative. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. Months have passed since that day. The ensuing scandal almost destroyed the company, but it survived. Julian is awaiting trial, his arrogance replaced by the grim reality of the consequences of his actions. Leo, in exchange for his testimony against his brother, received a lighter sentence. I see him sometimes, a hollowed-out version of the man he might have been. There is a deep, unbridgeable chasm between us now, filled with betrayal and regret. I did not fall apart. I did not retreat. I stepped in. I took back the reins of the company I helped create. Some were skeptical at first, seeing only an old woman. They soon learned that the mind that had once managed payrolls and negotiated contracts had not gone soft. I was my husband's partner in every sense of the word, and I knew this business as well as he did. I walk the construction sites now, the hard hat feeling familiar on my head, the smell of sawdust and concrete a comfort. Last week, I received a postcard. There was no return address, and the postmark was from a small coastal town in Portugal. There was no message, only a picture of a rickety old sailboat on a brilliant blue sea and a single, familiar signature at the bottom, A. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. I tucked the postcard into the blueprint I was reviewing. I don't need to find him. I don't need him to come back. He is free. And in a way, so am I. He trusted me to save our legacy. And I did, now. I am building a new one, my own. I am no longer a ghost in my own life. I am Eleanor Vance, and my story is far from over.